All right. This week was it week 16, the last readings for this semester, and I I I'm hoping to keep this to 10 minutes. I've got a lot to cover, and so I'll just jump right in. But this week we're talking about chapter 33, and want to get through the end of this chapter. It doesn't bring us to the present. However, most contemporary historians believe that uh, 25 years, the last 25 years would be uh, current history rather than or contemporary history rather than historical. So we brought it up to this point, and we'll kind of talk about a few themes today that I want you to take from this, and then maybe some ways that you can kind of put them together next week for the final. So one of the big themes that you're going to see this week is the rise of conservatism. And I've posted a crash course video this week on the rise of conservatism, which should give you a better understanding of what happened. But I'd like to give you a few of the things that I think are going to be important from the reading this week. First, the people are unhappy with Jimmy Carter, and they see Carter as not strong enough. He has these fireside chats that he does where he sits in a cardigan, and people are not happy with that. They want their president to be strong, to wear a suit. They don't want them to worry about the environment, which Carter is doing, which I'll get to more in a second. Ronald Reagan comes in with this idea to return to traditional values. And so a lot of conservatives get behind him. However, the silent majority is already upset and have been trying to push legislation to try to get to elect people that they believe were going to bring traditional values back to America. One of the things that I see that's wrong with this, the book doesn't really talk about it, but is this idea of always looking back, or in hindsight, that things are always greater, the idea of the golden age. And we all do this, okay? We all tend to take a look back and say, well, it was better when. And this is definitely what's going on at this time. You're getting a cultural backlash from society saying, we're tired of this, and that gives rise to the conservative movement. A lot of the things that they're upset with is the activism and the protests that are going on. They've been seeing a lot of protests from the civil rights era through Vietnam. You get a lot of people who are not happy with some of the things that are going on and don't see this as the nation progressing, but rather devolving. And so the conservative movement really is a backlash against liberal ideas, against traditional families. It's for liberal or for traditional families, but against these new ideas of what families are starting to look like, against gay rights, against Native American rights, all the things that we talked about last week. And so these are things that really you should be taking a look at as you look at the rise of conservatism. People just tired of a lot of the protests and the activism that's going on. Ultimately, what people wanted was lower taxes, and they wanted their government out of their lives. We see this same push today with the rise of the Tea Party a few years ago and the election of Donald Trump. These conservative ideas are still around and continue to push. In fact, a lot of Trump's base continue to use that same idea of the silent majority and call themselves that or self-describe as that. So self-defined. That's one of the things that I want to get across. We need to be able to look at this from both sides and be able to see that the rise of this conservative movement has a lot to do with what's going on, and it's a balancing of the two. Okay, you get through the 60s and 70s a lot of people who are pushing for liberalizing equality, things like that, and conservatives are like, whoa, we need to stop this, and we need to bring it back to traditional values, gender norms, family stereotypes, things like that. Okay, and so it really is this balancing act of the pendulum has swung too far to the left, and let's bring it back to the right. And so you get people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, some of these evangelical Christians who are pushing for people in power to now be more conservative. And it's an important piece of America. I think that it's fascinating, and I think that it's something that you should take a look at this week in your reading and be able to see how the conservative movement was constructed, why it took place, and how it balances the pendulum, at least through the late 80s and 90s. Okay, the pendulum continues to swing. I think that we see that the liberal movement with Barack Obama, and then a more conservative movement with President Donald Trump. And so you're getting to see this pendulum swing back and forth in a contemporary sense. Okay, a couple of things. Ronald Reagan is elected and takes over. However, during that, right before, some Islamic militants in Iran take over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and they take hostages. President Jimmy Carter works and works and works to get those people released. He really he puts a hold on all of their finances, on the Iranian militants' finances, and in a negotiation gives them back some of that money in return for hostages. However, the Iranian militants don't give the people back until Ronald Reagan is in office, which even today, I had a discussion with my mother a couple weeks ago, and she still believes that Ronald Reagan did that, was able to get people out of Tehran. And so this is something that we continue to see today as an issue, that Carter really pushed and pushed and pushed and made the negotiations to get them there, and they were pushing, the Iranian militants were working on making sure that Ronald Reagan was the guy who it looked like had done it. In the background, the Reagan administration was pushing guns. They were selling guns to the Iranians secretly as a way to get those hostages let loose. That money then was funded to the Contras in Nicaragua, a right-wing rebel group. This is something that Reagan was supposed to be against, with this idea of we don't negotiate with terrorists. However, they're selling guns to the Iranians, taking that money and funding the Contras in Nicaragua. I mean, we're all over the place in what we're doing, and an independent commission actually finds that Ronald Reagan knew about it and was in the wrong, and Reagan had to come out and say that he had lied to the American people. This is a big deal, I think, throughout the 80s, and something that we continue to look at as a black mark on the Reagan presidency. Not a lot of people think about Iran-Contra and that affair. However, a lot of those things continue to show how the United States government is meddling with countries around the world, and something that we need to be aware of continually. I mean, we're continually looking at those things. Okay. One of the things before I move on, Congress had chosen not to give money or not to back the Contras, which is why this is such a big deal. So funneling money for guns in Iran, and then funneling that money into Contras secretly, I mean, this is not a good thing, and a scandal that follows Reagan to this day. Okay, we see the end of the Cold War in this chapter. The end of the Cold War. What's interesting is that you have the Berlin Wall that falls in 1989, and the East and West Germany reunite under democracy, which is fascinating. And as that continues to happen, we see more and more communist countries begin to fall. The biggest one, obviously, the Soviet Union, which falls and collapses, and the Cold War is able to end in 1991. Multiple things happen there. Mikhail Gorbachev is really trying hard. He becomes friends with President Reagan, and they work on some ways to stop. But really, the biggest thing is Gorbachev doesn't see how he can continue to push the Cold War when his people aren't being able to eat, and so they stop communism and try to go to a sort of democratic government. We can see how that's played out today with Putin as president, and maybe you have a different idea, but take a look at some of these things which has led to the rise of Putin. Last, Reaganomics. This is something that we talk a lot about, I think, today. The idea of trickle-down economics or Reaganomics, and the idea of giving tax breaks to the rich, which then in turn creates more jobs, or the money falls down and the poor continue to get that money at some level. Tax cuts for the rich, trickle-down economics, it ends up not working. It results in massive debt, public debt, and the stock market collapse of 1987. Really, the idea of giving tax cuts to the rich has never been one that has been able to work out, that we've been able to see. And Reaganomics is one that doesn't add up. And you'll see that in the book this week as you do this reading. There's multiple other things that you could take from this chapter. But these are the big themes that I want you to take a look at and be able to understand that what's going on. Really, this turmoil of the 60s and 70s leads to this conservative movement of the late 70s, early 80s. That movement continues to persist as we see today, and these are some big things as to why. You can also see the rise of President Ronald Reagan and his Reaganomics as people continue to talk about trickle-down economics or giving tax cuts to the job creators and things like that. And maybe in some form or fashion or theory it does work. In this, at least in the 80s, it doesn't work, and it causes the stock market collapse of 87. So that's this week. I will put up a study guide video next week. We can talk about some of the themes that you're going to see on the final. Once again, it's not cumulative. It'll just be over the last few chapters. I hope that you have a great week. If you have any questions, reach out to me. We'll talk to you later.